The following is a special Viewpoints presentation of The War Files. The talk station is proud to present The War Files. The War Files, a selection of interviews honoring our warriors of the greatest generation, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
My name is James Beasley, for short, call me Jim Beasley. Born and raised in Surry County near Mount Airy, North Carolina. And I went to high school, finished high school there in Franklin High School in 1942. Immediately after finishing high school, I was awarded a scholarship at Elon College. And I was planning to go to Elon College in the fall of the year. But before I could get to Elon College, I knew that I would be drafted, and I did not want to go into the Army. But I wanted to get in the Navy. So I went down to Winston-Salem and joined the Navy. And they immediately sent me to Raleigh, where I was sworn in. And I spent the night in Raleigh. The next morning, a lieutenant came and got the group of us and swore the whole group in at the same time and said that this is your first military secret, gentlemen. You are going to Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Do not utter that word to anyone. You'll be put on a train in the morning, and tomorrow night you will probably end up in Chicago. We did. At Great Lakes Naval Training Station, I went through 3 months of strenuous boot camp, and my regimental commander there was Paul Brown, who had been the coach of the Cleveland Browns, and he was a tough man to work under. But it was very, very helpful and later, all of the things that he required of us. And after 3 months of boot camp, I was assigned to a school of my choice in Farragut, Idaho. I went there to signal school for an additional 4 months of training. And at the end of that, I was qualified as a petty officer first class. I went from apprentice seaman in boot camp to
That's 3 pay grades increase
right
in one short jump.
in 6 months, partly because of the scores I made in schooling. I was among the top 10 in the class, and I was immediately sent then to Bremerton, Washington, and assigned to the USS Liscome Bay, which was a small escort carrier. We carried the F-4F Wildcats, and we carried the SBD dive bombers and the TBF torpedo planes.
What was the purpose of an escort carrier?
It was to protect the invasion forces that went into Tarara and Macon Island. We protected supposedly the Marines and soldiers that went there, and we were assigned a certain area beyond the islands to any shipping or anything that came out of Japan. It was a CVE, they called them. Ours was the second one built. It was a CVE 56. The 55 at that time was the Coral Sea, but ours was the Liscome Bay, and the Liscome Bay is a small bay that's located in Alaska. Well, anyway, after commissioning exercises in Astoria, Oregon, finally we felt like, or Captain felt like, that we were ready to go to sea. So we went from there down to San Francisco, and we picked up some supplies and some more personnel there, and then we went to Long Beach, California, and we picked up the air group, part of the air group there, which was Admiral Henry Mullinax was assigned to our ship. He was in charge of 5 of these escort carriers. And at that time, we were assigned to the 5th Fleet, which was under the command of Admiral Spruance.
Right.
And from there, we went to San Diego, and we picked up additional personnel there. And from there, we went through some additional training, and eventually we were headed for Honolulu. We got to Honolulu in November 1943. From there, we did additional training, and on November the 10th, I think it was, we got underway, and when we got out to sea for about 2 or 3 days, the captain announced that we were headed for the Gilbert Islands and the invasion of Macon Island and Tarara. And on November the 24th, 1943, I was on the bridge of the ship where my station was as a signalman. All of my work was up there, and I was up there at 3:30 in the morning, and before 5 o'clock that morning, we were hit unexpectedly, totally unexpected, with a Japanese torpedo. One of the submarines had slipped through the nets outside and got to us, and we were in a turn to the northeast to launch aircraft going into the wind, and we got hit with this torpedo midship, and it was a terrific, horrible, horrible explosion. It hit the number 2 boiler and blew it up, and we had 13 or 15 airplanes on the flight deck ready for takeoff. They were revved up, gassed up, loaded with ammunition and whatever, ready to go. One was on the catapult, and it blew him right off of the ship, of course, immediately. And then the next explosion we had was also another terrific, horrible explosion.
How many men made it out?
234 of us managed to get off.
How many aboard the ship total?
And we had a little over 1,000 people.
Lost their lives.
750 some lost their lives. And that included the Admiral Mullinex, the captain of the ship, Captain Wiltsey, and the executive officer, Commander Finley Hall, and the first lieutenant, who was a lieutenant commander. But we lost tremendously there.
Did your other members of the Signal Corps make it out alive?
Well, that's a strange story. 5 of us out of 22 men in the signal gang got off. But the other people, we had sounded general quarters, and they were at their battle stations. My battle station was on the upper part of the bridge, commanding a signal light on the signal deck. And the chief signalman was up there, and 3 other signalmen that I knew real well. 5 of us got off.
The vessel begins to sink. What did you do?
Well, the captain left the bridge to go down to the flight deck to see if there was anything that could be done, and he lost his life there. The admiral was in the flag office, which was on the bridge, just below the wheelhouse, and he lost his life there. And the executive officer was in his general quarter station, which was aft at the second steering station back there in case he had to take over the ship. He was in his separate quarters, and he had absolutely no chance of getting away because that blew completely apart. Finally, I had found my life jacket, and I put it on, and then I had a terrible experience lifting the radar gear, which had broke loose from the mast of the ship and killed 2 people right in front of me. And I knew both of them. It was a boatswain's mate and a seaman. I went then to the gunnery officer, Bogle, and I said, "Sir, you're the chief officer that's left on the bridge. You need to give us some directions." And his reply was, "Get off this damn thing as quick as you can." It so happened that the signal officer, who was Lieutenant Hunt, and he and I knew each other pretty well. was standing behind me. And the Admiral's chief signalman was standing behind him. And when he said, "Get off of the ship," Lieutenant Hunt tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Beasley, do you know a way off?" And I said, "Well, let's go down through the wheelhouse and on down through the Admiral's flag office." And we started. And they stopped and waited for me to see if there was a passageway through there. Well, I got down to the Admiral's quarters there, and he was laying on his desk. And I lifted up his arm, and it fell back. I guess I was the last person that saw him. And I went back to the bridge, the top side, and told the lieutenant, I said, "You can't get through there. There's too much fire and smoke." I said, "Come with me. I know a passageway off of this bridge." And we went down to the flight deck. And the lieutenant was in front, and I was in the middle, so to speak, following him. I said, "Go aft. I know where there's some lines hanging over, it should be hanging over the side of the ship. If they're not, we'll throw them over and get down those lines." So, and the chief signalman was behind me. Well, we went, but we couldn't get any further because of the fire and the heat and the smoke and the ammunition going off in the ready rooms, and it was just a horrible situation. I said, "Lieutenant, let's turn around and go back. I know where there's another escape hatch." So we came back and catwalk along, we called it a catwalk, along the edge of the flight deck. Mm-hmm. And I jumped over in that, and sure enough, there was two boxes there. I knew where they were. I threw the lines over the side. One had knots, hand over hand knots tied in it. The other one was a slick line. When we turned around, that put the chief signalman in front, number one. I was still number two. Lieutenant Hunt was number three. Lieutenant Glenn Hunt from Texas. Good man. Anyway, I told the chief signalman, I said, "Try it, get on, let's go." He jumped on the line, got about halfway down, and I hollered, and I said, "How is it?" He said, "Good, come on down." Well, I started down, but when I did, I got the strings in my life jacket fouled up on a piece of steel, and I couldn't get it loose, and I was jerking and pulling, and I had a sheath knife on my belt, and I was reaching for that sheath knife to cut that. And I told the lieutenant, I said, "Come on, get around me and get down quick, because I've got to cut this thing loose." And he went on down the line also. Well, I finally got that thing loose, and I went down the line, and I was sure they would be waiting for me in the water. Till this day, I've never seen either one of them. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they were good swimmers or not. I was. I did not know I was wounded as bad as I was. I had 3 cracked ribs, and a bad left foot had gotten cut and busted somehow.
You never felt it?
Didn't feel it, didn't know it. And I had a wound in one of my arms, and I didn't know how that happened. Well, when I got in the water, there was a lot of fire on the water, coming from oil dripping over the side. And we were right under a 40-millimeter gun turret, and the ammunition was going off over our heads. And then there was a 20-millimeter gun turret just beyond that, and it was exploding and splashing. My hair caught on fire from that oil, and I had to keep my head underwater a lot to try to get out of that fire, which I finally did. And I was swimming hard to get away from the ship. When I looked around, I saw the ship was sinking pretty fast. I said, "I can't get away from this thing. I've got to go back and then go parallel to the thing to get away from it." And This is a strange incident that happened also. I started looking around and feeling around on top of the water. There was a lot of debris on top of the water. I said, I've got to find something that floats. I did not trust that life jacket. I had heard some bad stories about a K-pot life jacket. So I found a piece that was felt like it's about 4 or 6 inches thick, and it must have measured about 3 by 3. And I pushed it under the water, and it came back up and hit me in the face. I said, this is what I need. And later I found out, after it got to be daylight, it was a piece of cork out of the refrigeration units aboard the ship. But anyway, I was hanging on to that, and I heard someone, it's dark, I couldn't see. The sea was choppy that morning with a lot of whitecaps, and I heard someone holler, help, 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 and it coming from in front of me. I pushed my cork back there, and I went to where I thought the noise was coming from, and I felt something grab my legs. And I knew it was a human being, of course, because of the way it reacted. And I wrapped my legs around him and got him to the top. And I reached and got his hands. He was just barely conscious. And he got a hold of that piece of cork. And it had a little split in the middle. And I put his fingers in that split. Well, he was really in bad shape. And of course, he was a steward's mate. And a steward's mate at that time was all colored fellas, and they served the officers in the officers' quarters. It's what their job aboard ship was. I asked him what his name was. He told me it was Smith, but he kept coming and going. He would lose it. He'd talk to his mother, and then he would talk to other people, and then he would lose it. And I thought he was going to go away. So I reached over and got his dog tag, and I jerked loose. Well, when daylight came, I could see why he was in such bad shape. He was scalded. He was near a cooking unit or something when it hit, and he was burned real bad. His skin was hanging down, full of water. He had been hit with something in the head, and you could see the skull from the top of his head to his eyelids. I didn't know if he'd make it, but he did. He finally passed out, and I held on to him. We stayed together, and at daylight, I could see bobbling up and down, looked like 100 yards from us, 3 fellas on a plank. Well, I kept hollering and pushing and hollering and pushing toward them, and finally I got their attention, and they did the same thing, and the 5 of us got together. And I told them about this fellow. I said, now he's in bad shape. We've got to take care of him. They were in pretty good shape, all 3 of them. And so we took care of him, and I broke the cork in half. And I put half of it under one of his arms, and then I put the plank under the other arm, and he held on like that. Would have been somewhere between 8 and 9 o'clock. I don't know what time it was.
In the morning?
In the morning. And I saw this destroyer, the number on it, 410. Never forget it. And being a signalman, of course I knew the ships, their numbers, and their names. And it was the USS Hughes, an old destroyer, and it was steaming toward us. What was scattered out, they lowered a boat and started picking up survivors. I thought they'd gonna miss us, but I kept hollering and waving, and finally I saw the coxswain in the boat point his finger toward us, and he came to us with that boat and pulled us aboard. They had a hospital corpsman aboard, of course, and he had morphine for pain and that sort of thing, and he shot the fellow full of morphine, the colored boy, got him calmed down and asleep, and we took care of him. And then I said, there's 2 more people, I think, beyond us somewhere over there. I heard them earlier this morning. Let's go that direction. So the coxswain headed out in that direction, and I had to lay down in the boat because I discovered then that I was in pretty bad shape physically. He wanted to give me morphine, and I refused it. I said, no, I want to stay awake and I want to stay conscious. So we went to where I thought I heard those people hollering that morning, and sure enough, there was 2 people there, and one of them was Lieutenant Commander Bogler. And we picked him up, and I said, as far as I've seen, I haven't seen or heard any more around here. Well, we looked and went around a lot of places and this and that and the other with the boat. We couldn't find anyone else. We went back to the destroyer, and I climbed aboard, and I sat down on the deck under the shade of a 5-inch gun, and a hospital corpsman came by and said, you need attention, you need help. I said, yeah, I do. And so he looked at my foot, and it was cut open, my toes, 2 of them was torn apart. He poured that full of sulfur powder and wrapped it up in gauze and said, I think you'll be okay with that, but I can't help you with the other things, and sent me down to the infirmary. Well, the infirmary was full of people that they had picked up that was in far, far worse shape than I was in. I went back topside, and I watched them bury. Well, it wasn't any burial ceremony to it. They picked them up out of the water, and they died right there. They tied a 5-inch shell to them and back overboard. And that weighted the body down. After a fashion of looking and staying there in the area, finally they decided that this was all. And they left the area with us and took me and what was on the Hughes to the USS Leonard Wood, which was an old troop transport, but had been converted to a hospital ship. And they put us aboard this hospital ship, and I was assigned to a room, and next to I called him my friend then, the steward's mate, and they wrapped him up in gauze, except for his eyes and his nose and his mouth, and he was in bad shape. We stayed there. I'll never forget it. At that time, James Roosevelt, who was President Roosevelt's son, was with a group called Carlson's Raiders. And he came in, sat beside me, talked, and shook hands, and got acquainted, of course. And then we finally got underway on the Leonard Wood and headed toward Honolulu. We had wounded Marines, and we had all of the survivors that we'd picked up. There was another old troop transport there. They did the same thing with it, converted it. It was the Neville, the old USS Neville, and they had part of our survivors. And we got to Honolulu, and they sent me to the hospital, and then I found our chief signalman. He was a regular Navy fellow, been in for 20 years, and I asked him if he knew how many of the signalmen got off. He said, I think there was 5 of us, and out of a crew of 22. So I asked who they were, and we finally got their names, and I can still remember their names. It was Huff, and it was Andrews, and it was Beasley, and it was Goss, and it was Unbehagen. And I asked the nurse if she knew where Smith was. She said, yes, he's in the room next to yours. I went over to see him, and I sat with him, talked with him. He was conscious then and reasonable. I asked him if he remembered anything. He said, no, sir. I remember nothing. I said, you remember the name Beasley? He said, no, sir, I do not. I told him who I was and what I had done. I said, now, here's your dog tags. I'm going to lay them here on the nightstand for you. And I said, Smith, I hope someday, somewhere, somehow, our paths will cross again. He said, I hope so. So I left. That's the last time I ever saw the man.
We will return in a moment with part 2 of the War Files interview with Jim Beasley, World War II Navy veteran, right here on the Talk Station. This is the War Files. Now, part 2 of the War Files interview with Jim Beasley, World War II Navy veteran. After his recovery from his injuries sustained during the sinking of the escort carrier Liscome Bay, Jim receives his new orders and his next assignment.
One morning the doctor came in and gave me a thorough examination, and he said, Beasley, I'm going to certify that you are physically able for additional duty. And so another fellow came by and he had some papers for me sealed up with wax. He said, you are going to be assigned to an APA, which is an attack transport being commissioned in Portland, Oregon. You have 30 days to get there, and here's your train ticket. So instead of using that train ticket to go to Portland, I said, I'm going home. I got 30 days. So I went home, and I got home for Christmas. Shortly after Christmas, I left home and I reported to Portland, Oregon, and got assigned to the USS Alpine, which is an attack transport, carried first-line personnel, mostly Marines. We had capacity for 500 crack Marines, so to speak. And I was aboard when we commissioned her. After shakedown cruises in Puget Sound and others, we left and went to San Diego. We picked up boat cruise there, and we headed then for Honolulu, back to the South Pacific. And we left there finally and headed for the next invasion, which was the Gilbert Islands. And our assignment was to put those 500 Marines off at Guam. And so we did that, and that was the first airplane and we shot down. We shot down a bomber there, Japanese Betty. And then after that we carried troops into Saipan, which was part of the Marianas. And then we left there and went down to New Guinea, and we picked up some fresh troops there, some more Marines on Guadalcanal, and came out again, and they told us then we were headed for Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for the invasion there. And went through that invasion and the Battle of the Philippine Seas. Got out of there just in time before that Japanese battleships come into the harbor and sunk 2 aircraft carriers and some other vessels. We got out that night. Went by Surigao Strait, and we could see the gun battles going on down there. And they started up San Bernardino Straits, which is the center of the Philippines, and that's where the big battle was going to place. And of course Admiral Halsey struck out and went north because he heard the aircraft carriers was up there, which was a fake, pulled him off the battle. But anyway, that was not his fault. He done what he thought he should do. Well, we went back then to the Solomon Islands. We picked up additional personnel and supplies, headed back for Leyte for the second go-around. And while we were there, the Japanese had started this kamikaze thing. And about the fifth day we were there, we were attacked by a group of kamikazes. We shot down one of the planes that was headed for us, but the other one came and hit a midship and did extreme and critical damage and killed about 24 of our people. And anyway, we turned in and went back to the South China Sea and got repairs. And then we started getting ready, and we had to go back down to New Guinea and pick up some additional people at Guadalcanal and Solomon Islands. And coming back, we stopped off in Honolulu and then took off again. And when we got out to sea, they said we're going to Okinawa, the back door of the Japan. So we got there on April the 1st. On the first day that we were there, we had some bad situations because the Japanese had fooled us. They left the beaches clear, and some of our boats, Higgins' boats, was carrying Marines in, and I lost 2 more good friends there. The shell exploded over the boat and killed a whole half a boatload of people. We got the boat back to the ship and hoisted it aboard, and I could see my friend, who was a boatswain's mate, was killed, and a couple of seamen that I knew. On the second day of April, we were attacked again by suicide planes. The kamikaze came in just a little while before dark, and we shot down one about 50 yards from the ship and splashed him there. But the second one came in right over the mast of the ship, and I was standing there looking at him straight on when he came over, and I could see the pilot real well. Looked like a young fella, and looked like he was laughing. And he had that white scarf around his neck, and he hit us midship, the worst place he could have hit. And the bomb he was carrying penetrated the steel decks and exploded. It killed a bunch of the soldiers, the Marines, and some of our ship's company. And we were listing about 20 degrees and taking on water. And sometime after dark, the communications officer, Lieutenant Miller, came to me, and my job in the event we had to abandon ship had been assigned to destroy all of the secret documents and books and codes that we had. They were bound in lead-covered books, which would sink if you threw them overboard. And he came to me and said, "It looks like we might have to abandon ship sometime during the night. I want you to gather all of that stuff together, carry it to the side of the ship, and if we have orders to abandon ship, you're to throw it over the side." Well, I did that and stood by. But along about 12 o'clock that night, we finally got the fires under control. The next morning, a salvage ship came alongside and helped us with water hoses and other things, and we finally got the ship under control, and we got underway and moved out of the immediate zone where the battle was taking place.
Wow.
But we anchored again, and we stayed there about 5 days, shoring things up and welding things as best we could and putting it together, but we still had about 8-degree list. And then we got orders to get underway with an escort destroyer and head for Honolulu. And finally we got to Honolulu, hoping there would be a dry dock there that we could put the ship in and get it serviceable again to go back. They said they were full because the kamikazes had injured a lot of things there. And anyway, we was signed then to go to Seattle, Washington. Well, we went up there for a month, got in the dry dock, and they repaired the ship. And after about a month of that, we got underway again, was assigned to go back to the Pacific. And when we got to Honolulu, we loaded some crack Marines there and west to the Western Carolina Islands to Ulithia. And looked to me like the whole Pacific Fleet was there when we went in. All of the big carriers and the battleship North Carolina was there, the Iowa, its sister ship, the 56, the 55, I waved to them when we went by. Then we got a message, and I was privileged to a lot of information that a lot of other folks weren't privileged to, being in the signal gang. And I read those orders. We were to hit Japan somewhere in the middle part around Nagoya, and ours was to be a fake going in, turning around, and coming out to draw fire. Then there was a northern group going in, and then there was a southern group going in to make the invasion. We were to turn around then and go back. It was estimated, the numbers was in front of me, that we would have 1 million casualties. And the Japanese estimate was that they would have 5 million casualties. And I thought, well, boy, this might be it.
How did you respond when you saw that?
Well, I'll tell you this. Something happened to me aboard the Liscome Bay. When it was sunk, something happened that it took all the fear out of me. And I had no fear of dying or anything. And really, I still don't. And the only thing that I saw there, that there's a lot of people going to be killed here. And we're going to have to kill a lot of Japanese people. Of course, later we raised that figure because we found out that they had armed the men and the women and the children with sticks and any kind of weapons they could use, and everybody practically was committed to suicide. It's untelling how many people would have been killed, and at that time, General LeMay, with his B-52s, was bombing Japan with firebombs, and they were killing a lot of people. Of course, Admiral Halsey, he was out there with his fleet, and he was taking care of a lot of people too. And I went to the bridge one morning, and we got a message from Admiral Wilkinson, who was our admiral at that time, to cease all fire and to hold everything until they got further orders. And I knew then there was something brewing there that was unusual. That was an unusual message. I went to the signal officer and the communications officer, Lieutenant Miller, and I asked him, I said, what's going on? He said, we think there's going to be a peace treaty, possibly. He said, we dropped the atomic bomb. Well, I had no idea what an atomic bomb was. But I had a friend that had gone to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he was a scientist, and I went to him and I asked him, I said, what in the hell is atomic bomb? He tried to explain it, and I still didn't know. And then 2 days later, we found out that one had been dropped at Hiroshima, and then the other one, Nagasaki, was later. Then the Japanese decided they'd had enough. They wanted to quit. And so we got the message then that the peace treaty was going to be accepted, unconditional surrender from the Japanese, and we would get ready to help out in any way we could. So we took those troops to Japan and disembarked them there as occupational troops. And then we went back and we got another load of troops and we took them into Korea. This thing in Korea started a long time before they started shooting. We were getting ready for it then. And then we made another trip to Japan. And then on the way back to Honolulu, at that time, you accumulated points by the number of days you'd been in the Pacific, which I'd been out there nearly 2.5 years.
Did you get any points for being bombed and
the battles that you've been through, and the Purple Heart was worth about 5 points and other things. So I had
you had been pretty much in action for almost 2 straight years.
Constantly.
Other than one brief 30-day break to go home.
Right. That was it. Since 1943. This was 1945. And I'd been out there the whole time. But anyway, we going into Tacoma, Washington a few days later, and the Captain Riley, George Kenneth Gordon Riley, I'll never forget the man. He was a great man. I was packing my stuff. I was going to get off the ship the next day in Tacoma. Well, Captain Riley called me, sent his messenger down, and said, Beasley, Captain wants to see you in his quarters. I thought, Lord mercy, what have I done? You don't go up there unless you got a problem. But I went, and he was sitting behind his desk. I could see they had my records spread out in front of him. Captain Riley said, stand at ease, Mr. Beasley, or just sit down. And he said, Beasley, I've checked your records. I've checked your progress. I've checked everything that we have about you. You're the type of a young man that we want to keep in the Navy. I'm in a position to offer you some things that you might or might not be interested in if you'll sign over for another 4-year hitch. Said, I'll make you first-class petty officer, permanent rank. I'll give you 6 months shore duty anywhere in the United States you want to be stationed. I'll pay you mustering out pay, and I'll give you a 30-day leave. I'll never forget my remarks to Captain Riley. I don't know why I said these. It was a bit disrespectful the way it sounded, but it was not meant to be. I said, Captain, that's a great honor coming from you, sir, but I cannot accept your offer. Why not? I said, I'm enrolled in college. I had read about the GI Bill. And while I was in the Battle of the Philippine Islands, I wrote a letter to NC State and told them to enroll me and get my records straight. Hopefully I'd be home one day. Well, somewhere a letter caught up with me that they had done all that I asked them to do, and my records was in order. I had been enrolled at NC State to send them $10 for a room reservation. So I did that, and they'd be looking forward to seeing me after the war. So I told Captain Riley, I said, now, sir, I'm enrolled at North Carolina State. Immediately after the war, I'm going home and get a piece of paper saying that I know something. I said, I've been in the Navy long enough to know that if you're starting from where I started, it takes a long time to get where you are. And I want to sit in that chair. What do you mean? And I said, sir, no offense, but I've seen a lot of men come into this Navy with a college degree saying that they knew something. Whether they did or not, I don't know. But they immediately tagged them with Lieutenant J.G.'s bars and gave them responsibilities. And I said, now that's where I want to go. Well, that's very commendable, he said. He said, you're right. Said, I've been here for 35 years, and I'm still a captain. And he said, you were with me when we commissioned this ship. I wish you might want to stay with me because I'm going to take it up the East Coast to Newport News, and that's where the decommissioning will take place.
Wow.
You might want to go with us. There'd be a ceremony. I said, no, sir. I got off at Tacoma. I went to Norfolk, Virginia, eventually, on a train that they assigned me to. And there I was discharged. The day before I got out of there, a lieutenant came over to my barracks. I'd gotten the worst place I could possibly be, and I'd never been treated like I was treated there. It was just like I was nothing. And I was upset, terribly upset. It had been for 3 or 4 days. And the lieutenant came in and said, Beasley said, your medical records indicate that you are eligible for a medical discharge. You'll get some compensation. I said, what do I have to do to get that? He said, you need to go to the hospital and get a doctor's certification, and they're ready to certify it, that they'll give you a percentage of disability when you leave. And I said, well, how long will that take? I don't know. I said, Lieutenant, with no disrespect for you, but I said, I want you to go back over there to the administrative office, get my damn discharge, and you sign it, or somebody sign it, that I've served well and commendable and honorably, and bring it to me with a train ticket to Winston-Salem. I want to go home. He said, you going to forfeit that? I said, yeah, I'm finished. And I went home. And when I got home, I, of course, went back to school. I got my degree in 3 years. And then I started coaching and teaching. And after 1 year of that, I told my wife, I said, we might as well pack up. I don't believe I want to continue this way. I want to go to Nashville, Tennessee, to Peabody and Vanderbilt and get my master's degree. Then I went to the University of North Carolina for a while, and I ended up coaching, and I could see that I would make a better living as an administrator, and I had the degree and the knowledge, and so they offered me a job as a school principal in Avery County.
Question for you. That memorial was not built until 2004.
Right.
Why?
I don't know. I asked Senator Bob Dole the same thing, and he said it was because they didn't have the money. I said, I don't believe that. I think the problem is they didn't know how to put a memorial together that would cover the whole earth, so to speak, the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Now that you visited, what did you think? Do the event justice?
I think they did the best they could. And when I saw this from up there, I wasn't really disappointed, but I don't know what I expected. I hadn't seen it before.
Jim, this is a great story. Thank you very much for your time.
You've been listening to The War Files, a selection of interviews honoring our warriors of the greatest generation, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The War Files is a TalkStation presentation.